In August 1945, Japan did not simply lose a war. It lost everything that had organized daily life for a generation. The supply chains, the civic infrastructure, the assumption that tomorrow would resemble yesterday in any meaningful way. The cities were rubble. The rice supply had collapsed under the combined weight of crop failures, destroyed distribution networks, and the sudden repatriation of millions of soldiers who needed to be fed from a system that could barely feed the people already home. American occupation authorities estimated that the average Japanese civilian in 1945 was surviving on fewer than 1,500 calories per day. A working adult requires roughly 2,500. The gap between those two numbers is where the meals on this list were born. Out of that gap, something unexpected happened. Cooks who had nothing invented everything. They stretched scraps into meals with a creativity that no culinary school teaches, because no culinary school has ever had to. They borrowed flavors from foreign soldiers, repurposed ingredients that polite society had never considered food, and built a cuisine of pure necessity that kept an entire country alive long enough to rebuild itself into one of the great economic powers of the modern world. Number 20 on this list was eaten by children on the way to school because there was nothing else in the house. Number 14 was technically illegal under occupation food rationing laws, and people made it anyway, in back kitchens and on charcoal braziers hidden from inspectors. Number 8 uses a part of the ingredient that every modern cook discards without a second thought. Number 2 contains a preparation method so quietly brilliant that restaurant chefs in Tokyo are only now beginning to charge serious money to recreate what exhausted post-war mothers did automatically, from necessity, in kitchens with no gas and no budget and no margin for waste. These 25 dishes are the real food of post-war Japan, not the elegant kaiseki, not the celebrated ramen origin stories. The food that people actually made when the shelves were empty, the ration card was spent, and the family was waiting at a table that had very little to put on it. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count every single one down. Number 25. Zosui, rice gruel with whatever existed. Before ramen became a symbol of post-war Japanese resilience, before the economic miracle gave the country back its appetite, there was zosui, leftover rice simmered in water until the grains bloated and softened and surrendered their individual identity into a unified porridge that was more liquid than solid and more sustenance than pleasure. The dish predated the war by centuries. Every Japanese grandmother knew it. But post-war Japan turned what had been an occasional cold-weather comfort into a daily survival calculation. Rice was rationed strictly by occupation authorities, allocated by household size, distributed through neighborhood associations, logged and monitored with the bureaucratic thoroughness of a military operation. A family's weekly rice allocation, consumed at normal density, fed them for perhaps 4 days. Stretched into zosui, it could feed them for 7. That arithmetic was the most important cooking technique of the post-war era, and every mother in every bombed-out city in Japan understood it completely. Zosui required no recipe beyond the decision of what to add to the water. A wilted green pulled from a neighbor's garden, a single dried sardine from a dwindling supply, a scrape of miso from the bottom of a nearly empty crock. The dish was as varied as the poverty that produced it, which is to say it was endlessly varied. Elderly Japanese interviewed in the 1990s about their post-war memories mentioned zosui more consistently than almost any other dish. Not with bitterness, but with the particular warmth that people reserve for things that kept them alive when staying alive required genuine effort. Number 24, kasujiru, sake lees soup. When the sake breweries reopened in the years immediately following the war's end, they produced 2 things: sake for a population that badly needed it, and sake lees, the thick white paste remaining after the rice mash had been pressed, which accumulated in quantities that the breweries had no immediate use for. Most of it should have been discarded. In a country where nothing was being discarded, it was not discarded. Home cooks in the neighborhoods surrounding breweries discovered that sake lees dissolved in hot water produced a broth with body and depth that plain water never achieved. Into this broth went whatever root vegetables had survived the week. Daikon cut thick, taro simmered until yielding, a piece of salted salmon if the family had managed to obtain one through the black market or the weekly ration. The resulting soup was warm, faintly alcoholic in aroma, deeply savory in a way that its nearly zero cost had no right to produce. What nobody in those post-war kitchens knew, and what nutritional research has since documented, is that sake lees contains residual yeast, amino acids, B vitamins, and live fermentation cultures that thin vegetable soups completely lack. Families drinking kasujiru through the hardest winters of the late 1940s were accidentally supplementing their nutritional intake in ways that helped offset the deficiencies their restricted diets would otherwise have caused. The breweries gave away what they considered waste. The cooks turned the waste into medicine. This is the pattern that defines every dish on this list. Number 23. Imo gayu, sweet potato porridge. The American occupation introduced expanded sweet potato cultivation as an emergency food security measure in 1945 and 1946, recognizing that rice production alone could not sustain the population through the immediate post-war years. Japanese farmers planted sweet potatoes everywhere that soil existed: roadsides, vacant lots, the edges of bomb craters, the strips of earth between railway tracks. By 1947, sweet potatoes had become the most abundant food in many urban neighborhoods, which meant they had also become the most eaten food, regardless of whether anyone particularly wanted to eat them. Imo gayu, sweet potatoes boiled down into a thick porridge, thinned with water and sweetened by the vegetable's own natural sugars, was the morning meal for millions of Japanese children through the late 1940s. It required almost no preparation skill, almost no additional ingredients, and almost no money. The sweet potato's natural sugar content made imo gayu the only sweetness in many households, a fact that children noted and remembered. Oral histories collected from Japanese people who were young during the occupation years return again and again to the taste of sweet potato porridge as the flavor that most completely represents the period. Not with disgust, with a complicated tenderness for a time that was hard, and that was also in the specific way that childhood renders even difficult things theirs. Number 22. Yakiimo, roasted sweet potato from the street vendor. In the ruins of Japanese cities, before the infrastructure of normal commerce had been rebuilt, before shops had goods and markets had supply, certain entrepreneurs appeared pushing handcarts fitted with small stone ovens. They roasted whole sweet potatoes over charcoal and sold them for a few yen each, announcing their presence through neighborhoods that were still partly rubble with long, mournful cries that became one of the defining sounds of the era. Yakiimo vendors filled a specific and critical gap. They provided a hot meal to families whose kitchens had been bombed out of existence, whose charcoal rations were too small to support cooking, or who simply had no vessel left to cook in. For many urban families through 1945 and 1946, a yakiimo from a street vendor was not a snack between meals. It was the meal, 1 potato per person, eaten standing on a street corner that had been a neighborhood 6 months earlier. The caramelization of the sweet potato sugars against the heat of the stone oven produced an aroma that occupation-era memoirs describe with striking consistency, sweet and woody and warm in a way that felt disproportionate to its source, the smell of something good happening in the middle of something terrible. Those vendor cries survived on recordings long after the poverty that made them necessary had passed. Elderly Japanese heard them played back in documentary programs and described a physical response, a tightening in the chest, a sudden specific hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with the alchemy that turns survival into memory. Number 21, suten, flour dumplings in miso broth. When rice disappeared entirely, when the ration had been consumed, and the next distribution was days away, and the family was looking at an empty pantry with the particular calm that comes from having already exhausted panic, flour filled the gap. Wheat flour arrived in Japan through American food aid programs in significant quantities, beginning in 1946, distributed partly to address the caloric shortfall and partly to create a market for American agricultural surplus. The occupation fed Japan wheat, and Japan made sutan. Sutan was not a refined dish. Wheat flour mixed with water and salt worked minimally into a rough dough, torn by hand into irregular pieces, and dropped directly into simmering miso broth. The pieces came out dense and chewy in a way that had no relationship to the delicate dumplings of pre-war Japanese cuisine. This did not matter. What mattered was that soutan was hot, filling, and could be produced from ingredients that cost almost nothing, and were available even when everything else was not. Rural communities in Gunma, Saitama, and Yamanashi prefectures adopted soutan so completely during the post-war years that it survived long past the necessity that created it. It is sold today in rural tourist restaurants in those regions, described on menus as a regional specialty. The poverty of its origin is not mentioned. The flavor, which is honest and filling and tastes like the specific ingenuity of people who refuse to go hungry, remains entirely intact. Number 20. Pan no mimi, bread crust scraps. American military bread began appearing in Japanese communities through multiple channels: occupation troop kitchens, food aid programs, black market traders who obtained surplus from military bases and sold it into the civilian economy at prices that were high by post-war standards and affordable by no other. The bread itself was unlike anything in traditional Japanese cooking: soft, pale, faintly sweet, made from white wheat flour that produced a texture to Japanese rice culture had no equivalent for. The crusts, pan no mimi, literally the bread's ears, were considered the least desirable part and were often separated from the loaves and sold cheaply, given to children, or distributed through neighborhood networks as something between charity and commerce. Post-war mothers discovered that pan no mimi, dried slightly in a pan and then fried in a spoonful of oil with soy sauce and sugar, caramelized into something that tasted startlingly close to a treat. Children ate them as after-school snacks. Adults ate them as the full evening meal when nothing else was available. The transformation of discarded bread crust into something children actively looked forward to, something that made the kitchen smell good, that produced a sound of sizzling when it hit the hot pan, that came out golden and sweet, savory, and warm, represents in miniature everything that post-war Japanese home cooking accomplished at its best. Number 19. Chazuke, tea poured over cold rice. The simplicity of chazuke is deceptive. Cold leftover rice in a bowl, hot green tea poured over it until the grains soften slightly and the liquid fills the spaces between them. A pinch of salt and a pickled plum, if available, eaten immediately before the rice absorbs all the liquid and the temperature drops. This is the complete recipe. It requires no cooking in any meaningful sense. It requires only the decision to call it dinner. In post-war Japan, that decision was made millions of times. Chazuke was the meal that appeared at the end of the day when the food that was supposed to last until tomorrow had already been eaten. It was the meal made for oneself after the children had been fed with the last of the proper food. It was the midnight meal, eaten cold, without heating anything, when lighting the stove felt like too much effort after a day of too much effort. Tea. Tea was one of the few commodities that remained available throughout even the worst shortages. Its heat, poured over rice that would otherwise be eaten cold and plain, transformed a leftover into something that qualified as a meal by the most honest application of that word. What is remarkable is not that the chazuke existed. It is that chazuke survived prosperity. As Japan's economy recovered and food became abundant, chazuke did not disappear with the poverty that had made it necessary. It evolved. Refined versions appeared in restaurants, elaborate toppings developed. The dish became associated with the elegant minimalism of Japanese aesthetics rather than the desperate minimalism of post-war hunger. The same bowl, eaten by completely different people for completely different reasons, tasted like two entirely different things. This is what it means for a food to contain history. Number 18. Natto Gohan, fermented soybeans over rice. Natto divided Japan before the war and continued dividing it after, the fault line running roughly between east and west along boundaries that corresponded to historical clan territories, dialect regions, and a deep cultural disagreement about whether the smell of fermented soybeans in the morning was appetizing or unbearable. Eastern Japan ate natto. Western Japan, for the most part, did not. The post-war period did not resolve this disagreement. It made natto more essential to the half of the country that already ate it. Fermented soybeans required no refrigeration, no cooking beyond the initial fermentation that the manufacturer had already performed, and almost no preparation. The packet opened, the contents stirred vigorously with chopsticks until the sticky threads developed, a splash of soy sauce and a dab of mustard if available, the whole mass poured over hot rice and eaten immediately. In a post-war economy where every step of food preparation carried a cost in fuel, time, and equipment that many households could not reliably meet, natto's complete readiness was as nutritionally important as its protein content. Occupation-era health surveys identified Eastern Japanese communities with high natto consumption as having notably lower rates of certain nutritional deficiency conditions compared to communities in similar economic circumstances that did not eat it. The data was recorded and filed. The grandmothers stirring their natto every morning before dawn did not need a health survey. They already knew. Paste this story exactly as written. Number 17. Tofu no miso shiru. Plain miso soup with tofu. Miso paste survived the war in ways that more fragile foods did not. Ceramic crocks buried in the ground. Supplies hidden in the back rooms of damaged shops. The careful hoarding of women who understood that fermented soybean paste was irreplaceable and could not be produced quickly when supplies ran out. The post-war years tested those reserves to their limits, and the daily bowl of miso soup became both a nutritional anchor and a ritual of normalcy in lives where normalcy had been comprehensively destroyed. Plain miso soup with a few cubes of tofu and a sliced green onion was the meal that said the household was still functioning. The miso provided amino acids, beneficial fermentation cultures, and B vitamins that the starch-heavy post-war diet desperately needed. The tofu added protein in the only form that was consistently available and consistently affordable. Together in the bowl, they created something that tasted like the life that existed before the war. Not identical, but structurally similar enough to provide the comfort that structural similarity provides when everything else has changed. Survivors interviewed across multiple oral history projects consistently described the smell of miso soup heating in the morning as the most emotionally significant food memory of the post-war years. Not the taste, the smell, the specific moment when the miso dissolved into the hot water and the kitchen filled with that particular warm, fermented, deeply familiar aroma that meant someone was making breakfast, which meant there was breakfast to make, which meant today was going to be a day that continued rather than stopped. L number 16. Tamago kake gohan, raw egg over hot rice. A single raw egg cracked over a bowl of hot rice. A splash of soy sauce stirred through until the yolk broke and spread in golden ribbons through the white grains. Eaten immediately before the egg cooked from the residual heat of the rice. This is tamago kake gohan, the simplest protein delivery in the Japanese kitchen, and the meal that thousands of post-war diaries describe as the first sign that things were beginning to get better. Eggs were among the earliest protein sources to become reliably accessible as Japan's agricultural sector began recovering in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Chickens could be kept in small spaces, fed on minimal grain, and produced protein continuously in a way that larger livestock could not. When eggs became available in local markets at prices that working families could afford, the immediate response of cooks across Japan was tamago kake gohan, the fastest, most direct route from a single egg to a complete meal. No cooking required beyond the rice that was going to be cooked anyway. No fuel consumed beyond what was already allocated. The egg transformed the rice from a starch into a meal, and the transformation cost nothing beyond the egg itself. Post-war diaries from the early 1950s mentioned tamago kake gohan with a frequency and a warmth that suggests people understood they were eating it at a threshold moment. They were not wrong. It was the egg that announced the worst was passing. The rice was always there. The egg meant something had returned. Number 15. Okara no itameni, stir-fried soybean pulp with vegetables. Okara, the white fibrous pulp remaining after soybeans have been pressed to extract the liquid for tofu or soy milk production, was produced in large quantities by tofu manufacturers operating throughout the post-war period and sold for prices approaching nothing, given away to customers at the point of purchase, or distributed through community networks as something between a food and a charitable gesture. Most of it, by any pre-war standard of culinary respectability, should have been discarded. It was the byproduct of a byproduct, the waste product of a process that itself began with a humble soybean. In post-war Japan, where the concept of discarding edible material had become genuinely incomprehensible to people who were calculating calories at the household level with the precision of military logisticians, okara was food. Edamame, stir-fried with carrots, burdock root, shiitake mushrooms, and seasoned with soy sauce, mirin, and dashi, okara absorbed the flavors of everything cooked with it and contributed fiber, plant protein, and a satisfying density that stretched a small amount of expensive seasoning ingredients into a complete side dish. The technique of taking what everyone else discards and finding within it something genuinely nourishing is not unique to post-war Japan. But post-war Japan practiced it at a scale and with a consistency that produced an entire generation of cooks for whom waste was not a philosophical position, but a physical impossibility. The okara in the pot was not a choice. It was the answer to a question the empty pantry had asked. What meals would you want to try? Drop your answer in the comments. And if your family carries any memory of this era, a dish, a smell, a story from a grandmother's kitchen that you only half understood at the time, write it in the comments before it disappears. Some of the most important history in the world is still sitting at somebody's table, waiting to be remembered before the last person who lived it stops being able to tell it.